All right, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. It's the one and only V, the Gorilla Economist, coming to you live. It's the Sirius report. That's right. It's the Sirius report. We got with us our main man, London Paul himself, back on the regularly scheduled circuit. SiriusReport.com, folks. If you haven't gotten a chance, go over there, go check it out. For less than the price of a latte that I am sipping this morning from Starbucks. You get yourself a daily dose of London Paul himself, giving you the play-by-play of what's going on geostrategically all throughout the world. So go there for less than $5, $4.75. Go there, thesiriusreport.com. Audio files drop right into your computer, right into your system, wherever you are. You can listen to it. It is a fantastic report. And we here at Rogue are huge fans of it. So with that being said, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Good morning. I almost said CJ. Good morning, V. Yeah, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone wherever they're listening. Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. And yourself?
I'm hanging in there, Paul. I'm hanging in there. It was freezing this morning. I woke up, it was 35 degrees out here in the Empire State. Hey, you know what I found out? We actually have a really good candidate for governor this year. A real libertarian, man. Guy was on the Joe Rogan show and everything. His name is Larry Stark. Really amazing ideas, and he's actually gathering crowds. Who would have thought? Who would have thought?
Well, with that kind of credibility, he's probably not going to go far, is he?
Hey, man. Hey, you're on the Joe Rogan
jokes
show.
Aside. Yeah.
That's some serious credibility right there.
I'm joking. It's just the state of Western politics. Anyone who's got a brain doesn't generally succeed.
I've messaged to get him on, V.
What?
I've messaged Larry to get him on, so hopefully we'll be.
Dude, that would be great, man. Larry Stark would be fantastic. He's got my vote. I will work diligently. I think New York is perfect. Instead of being libtard to be libertarian, but we'll see what happens, man. The Democrats here are just absolutely criminal, just as they are in Illinois and in California and anywhere else they are. Criminal behavior, Paul. Criminal behavior. But all's well in the UK, I assume. I mean, you have Theresa May.
Yeah, well, we won't go on about the whole Brexit debacle, but
what Brexit debacle? What happened, Paul? Inquiring minds want to know. I think the only to know the latest on Brexit is it happening? Is it not happening? It's like a bad breakup. What's going on?
It's the ugliest divorce in the history of divorces.
Oh my God!
I mean, from what I understand, it has got to the situation where, of course, the European Union and London will never reach an agreement because the European Union, of course, doesn't want the UK to leave easily, because other nations like Italy, being a great example, may sit there and go, well, if it's that easy, we'll leave too. It's got to the point Berlin's had to intervene and introduce some sort of common sense into the proceedings and to get a resolution, because Germany rightly realizes if we don't resolve the problem, Britain just leaves with no deal. It's not only going to wreck the UK economy, it's going to wreck the European Union. So they've interceded, and I don't put much credence to the fact that May says, we're 95%, of the way there to reaching a deal. But, it's always that niggly last 5%. Well, it's been the last niggly 5% for 2 years. So I don't place much credence. It's going to be one of those situations, probably. The UK leaves on, I think it's the 29th of March next year. It'll probably be the 27th of March, and then they'll get an agreement. It's a bit like the US government shutdown. We know it's never going to happen, and it's all theatre, and then eventually they reach an agreement. And I'm sure they probably will, because a no Brexit deal is bad news for both sides. But, I mean, Theresa May just hardly covered herself in glory and her government in how they've handled this, but that equally neither has the European Union. So people often ask me, why don't you comment on it? Well, I'll comment on it when there's something worth talking about, because really for 2 years it's all, kabuki theatre. That's the best way to put it. There's been you could have sat down and intelligently resolved this in about 4 weeks or less, and that's how simple it is. But of course, we know how politics works. So, but yeah, UK side. Well, it's just rather like the US. The economic reality is biting, and debt levels are not as high as the US, but of course people are significantly in debt. the retail sector's collapsing, but unemployment's at record lows. I mean, it's just the same nonsense. The FTSE's riding high, and it's the same economic illusion that the US faces. But economic reality is going to hit home in the fullness of time, as we know.
Paul, we have. I don't know if you're being invaded or not, but we're on the cusp of being invaded. Did you hear about the army that is marching north towards the United States? Did you hear about this?
Yeah, I was one of the myriad of things I had lined up to talk about. Yeah, I mean, as I always say, timing is everything. I mean, there's claims Soros is paying refugees. Well, would that really surprise anyone? I mean, this is on the eve of the midterms, and I think it's a blatant provocation or an attempted provocation of Trump prior to the midterms. And, he talked about bringing the military into the equation. I know why he's saying it, but he shouldn't, because he's playing into the hands of the deep state cabal who are trying to use to stoke up and fuel tension. They're trying to present Trump in a bad light, thinking in some way it's going to impact the midterms. Now, I'm not suggesting it will. It's a complete act of desperation. But I think it was only maybe an hour ago, Trump said he's alerted Border Patrol and the military that this migrant caravan is a national emergency. Now, what transpires, I don't necessarily say will have an impact on the midterms. It may do or it may not do, but Trump needs to be careful how he handles this, as difficult as that may be. But it's blatant provocation. I mean, you couldn't make the timing up if you tried. They're just going to arrive just prior to the midterms. I mean, how coincidental is that? So, yeah, it's rather like the whole Kavanaugh fiasco. It was the same thing. It was an attempt to politically, in some way, discredit Trump, and that blew up in their face. And the same thing is probably likely to happen. But, it's just, I mean, you couldn't have made this up if you tried. And why is it happening now? Well, we know exactly why.
With that being also said, Paul, your take on the latest ramblings and musings of the entire world. We have the situation in Crimea where we had a terror attack, all intents and purposes. God, we know how those things go. We have also the situation with Iran. We have the Khashoggi situation. Okay, Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah.
It seems as Mohammed bin Salman has made him into a human kebab, is the reports that I'm hearing, Paul. I mean, where do you want to start? Yeah. I mean, what a plethora of things.
Before we go into the specifics on something, it's worth talking about. I've said this before, that there are kind of back channels and forces at play in the world that allows us to go to bed at night and wake up in the morning and the world's more or less the same. And that is never been more prominent than at this point in time. I would say in recent weeks, maybe a month or two, we're in a position now where the cabal are struggling on multiple fronts to keep their empire going. And we can talk about Iran and all these things in due course, but that is absolutely clear. And when in that situation, we're in dangerous, ugly kind of times where I'm not suggesting World War III is going to happen. I'm not suggesting the cabal are going to win, but we're in a situation for me where, the forces at play to keep the world in an equilibrium have never had a more challenging time in the last maybe year or two. That's what I feel is happening. And, the problem we have in the world is that we don't have enough people in positions of authority or are capable of dealing with matters. So we have to have cooler heads in the military, etc., who manage to keep the world on an even keel. And I think, the Middle East is a great example of that. And we can talk a bit about Khashoggi in a minute. But I think we're at that position, and it was inevitable. I mean, as much as I say the cabal's finished, and they are, it doesn't mean that we still don't have to be vigilant, not us specifically, but the people who are trying to ensure we do go to bed in the evening, wake up in the morning, and the world's a safe place. Because I think, in recent times, there's been a number of situations which could have escalated and got completely out of hand. And the Middle East is a great example of that, but not solely there. And why is this happening? Well, why is it increasing? Well, pretty obviously the US, the Treasury dumping is enormous now, and it's no longer being hidden. You've got huge gold buying going on across the world. I mean, even in Europe now, you've got nations like Hungary who increase their gold holdings tenfold. Russia's buying enormous quantities, and so are a number of other European nations, never mind Russia and the Far East. You're seeing more and more of the issue of the adoption of SWIFT alternatives. And the dollar is sort of dying because it's been abandoned effectively, rather than the idea that you're going to shot the dollar. Dollar's just organically dying in global usage for all those reasons, and that is why, of course, as we say, if you kill the dollar from the cabal perspective, it's game over. So that's why I think we're seeing an escalation in tensions. And this intermediate range nuclear forces treaty that was signed in '87 by Gorbachev and Reagan, which prohibits the deployment and the development and testing of ground-launched ballistic or cruise missiles with ranges, I think, several hundred miles. Is it 300 miles to about 3,500 miles? Of course, what do we hear just 2 days ago? Trump's announced that the US is going to withdraw from the INF treaty because they're alleging that Russia has violated the agreement, which actually, ironically, Russia has numerous or has significant body of evidence to say, actually, it's the US who is in violation and we're not. And of course, there's going to be naturally a bit of concern about this because from the Russian perspective, their argument is, well, you shouldn't just unilaterally pull out of this, what was termed a landmark Cold War era treaty that obviously eliminated principally nuclear missiles from Europe. So the question is, why is this happening? Because timing as ever is everything. I don't think this is any sort of electioneering attempt by Trump to portray the US in a position of strength, although people are trying to say, this is a position of strength from the US perspective, that they're walking away. It's not. It's actually a position of weakness. Russia will argue they've never violated the INF treaty, and when the US was pressed to produce the evidence, of course, they don't. It's rather like Assad's got chemical weapons, we'll produce the evidence. And they never do. Now, in essence, what's this about? Well, it's multifold. It's not just a broadside at Russia. It's also a broadside at China. Because if you scrap this treaty, for argument's sake, not only can you put nuclear weapons across Europe, although I don't think nations like Germany or France or Italy or nations like that will accept it, but certain Eastern European nations, Romania, maybe Croatia, nations like that may, buckle and agree to it. But the other problem you'd have is you could arguably put them in South Korea, you could put them in Japan, you could put them in places that may stoke up a myriad of tensions in relation not just to North Korea, but also ultimately to China and Russia. Now, what I think this shows why the US is walking away from it is because it lacks the capability to defend itself with conventional weapons. And I think, it comes back to that landmark speech we covered many times back in March when Putin told the world, do you know what, we've got military technology we haven't told you about. That changed everything. And we said there would be a huge amount of repercussions. And I think this is another repercussion because the US lacks resources. They admit that. I mean, how many Pentagon reports are now saying, the US is ill-equipped to fight multiple wars on numerous fronts. It lacks finance, although some will say, well, what the hell happened to the $700 billion that was, allocated to the military budget? So the US is effectively, backed into a corner. So now it needs to resort to nuclear proliferation as a way of trying to control elements in the world that it's now lost control of. Now, this doesn't mean there's going to be a nuclear war. It doesn't mean ultimately anything major or serious will come as a result of it. But there's a rationale and a reason. And I think the US is walking away from the INF because it realizes just how far ahead Russia and now even China is with regards to missile defense systems, hypersonic missiles, even tanks, and even, what we might term light weapons. And note how, I can't remember which Russian official it was, made a joke the other day about the S-700s, Well, they exist. The Russians have a fully operational S-500s.
Whoa,
It
did you
has
say
S-600.
S700?
Yes, he made a joke about the S-700s.
What the heck is the S700? Because the S500 is bloody amazing.
Well, precisely. But of course they have the S-600 and the S-700. I mean,
Wow.
it's what Russia will always, at certain times, show the world we've got this technology. But as we've said many times for a long time, there's several iterations behind the technology they actually have. And here's the point. God forbid we ever have a situation where we end up with a world war, and I have no reason to believe we will. But the Russians are hardly going to telegraph to the world the technology they actually have as opposed to what the world thinks they have. So the question regarding this whole walking away from the INF is, where's the US going to put nuclear weapons now? It could be a situation where, ironically, this leads to is another kind of nail in the coffin lid of NATO, because European nations may say, do you know what? We're not putting these weapons in our country and facing off against Russia. This is ridiculous. Okay, there's going to be odd Eastern European nations who'll be bullied or cajoled into to doing so, but I'm not really thinking this is a major problem. It may be just a bit of the US puffing its chest out, trying to appear strong, even though from China and Russia's perspective, they see it as a position of weakness. However, why Trump ever entertained this idea, I think, is questionable, because it is of no benefit. People talk about this relationship that exists between China, Russia, and the US. Well, this is not an example it's an example that proves that's nonsense, because China and Russia are not very happy about this. We'll talk about Bolton's. Ironically, Trump makes this statement and Bolton's now in Moscow. So, to be a fly on the wall in the conversations he's having, but we'll come to Bolton in a minute. But the question is, there isn't this relationship. The thing with the relationship with Russia was the intention was for the US to befriend Russia and to divide Russia and China. And when Russia made it very clear that was never going to happen, then we started to see a change of even to the extent of further sanctions to the point of absurdity with Russia, trying to intimidate Russia. And in the process, the whole trade war with China has got nothing to do with, in reality, the trade deficit between the nations. It's because the US now sees China as a major threat. It thinks it wants US hegemony for itself. It wants the yuan to be the world's reserve currency, and it wants to dictate how the US has dictated to the world for decades. And of course, China's got no intention of doing that, because it knows it's a fool's errand, and in the end, you'll lose everything and end up economically and militarily extremely weak if you do that. So what's the point in doing that? Of course, they're not going to do that. But this is a very, very unnecessary development. It ultimately will achieve nothing from the US perspective. I mean, what do they think they're going to do? Get them to go, the Russians and the Chinese, to go to the negotiating table? They're going to say no, because again, you're trying to threaten us and have coercion and make us, acquiesce to what you want us to. And they're going to refuse to do that, which is, how long does the Trump administration need before it learns, that tactic simply isn't going to work. So that's one development that's recent, and I think is a reason to have a degree of concern. Now, in a broader sense, and a lot of people kind of got a bit upset when I talked about the whole neocon influence in the Trump administration, as though, and I'm not saying it's cast in stone, but I think a lot of people are putting a lot of hope in certain individuals, and it remains to be seen how this pans out. And Kavanaugh, or however people want to pronounce it, I only say Kavanaugh because I knew someone with the same surname who years ago told me that it was pronounced Kavanaugh, but you can pronounce it however you like, it doesn't matter. Now, for me, his links to the Bush family and his act in the Patriot Act is a reason to be concerned. And I'm, because a lot of people are saying, well, you're putting all the hopes in Kavanaugh, he's the one who's going to tip the balance in the Supreme Court from the 4-4 to the 5-4. Well, the question is, I mean, has Kavanaugh pledged to Trump that he's going to turn on his paymasters of the past and the people he worked with to do with the Bush administration? What's going to happen? Is he going to start to adjudicate Republicans and neocons as well as Democrats as part of the process? Because all we keep still hearing is the Democratic swamp's going to be drained. That's a big concern to me. Now, I'm not saying that Kavanaugh can't do this or won't be able to, but himself can't make all these changes unless you replace the Branton-Rooch mechanism of the US legal system, which we said many, many months ago. Now, back to this point, I can't see anything happening before the midterms, but hopefully we'll see progress after the midterms in terms of Trump being able to deal with the deep state cabal, swamp, whatever you want to call it, but he faces enormous challenges, and I think there's a huge expectation on Kavanaugh's shoulders, which maybe eventually he'll succeed, but he's not going to succeed in 2 weeks or 2 months. This is the reforms of the root and branch of the US judiciary is going to take years potentially. So the idea that somehow we're going to arrest all these people and it's all going to happen seamlessly overnight is not a reality. And if we think this is going to happen, 2 of the biggest cabal architects, David Rockefeller died, Zbyszek Brzezinski died. Did anything change? No. Because removing most of the people that people think are important, they're just symbolic. They don't address the root of the problem. The real cabal controllers are not even mentioned publicly. And then we come on to the business about the US economy, and it's kind of interesting because Trump knows the US economy is going to collapse. And why does he know this? Because he's attacking the Fed for their interest rate rise policy. And he's absolutely correct. The Fed raising interest rates is a farcical policy because the US is so heavily indebted that raising interest rates, I mean, this is common sense. You're going to affect everybody who's in debt, be it the US government, be it the US person in the street who's got, indebted from student debt, auto loan debt, credit card debt, mortgages, whatever it might be. So the question is, what's happening? Well, for me, it's a standoff between the fact of when does this economic collapse happen? And I think the Fed will be looking to blame Trump. And in a sense, he's given them a degree of ammunition because they can point to the China trade war and say, well, that was, a errant policy. You can look at sanctions because sanctions is causing the de-dollarization. We know that the Trans-Pacific partnership's a farce, but they'll point to things like, well, Trump's walking away from trade deals, which he shouldn't have done. And they'll attack him on this protectionist policy. And I think at some point there's going to be a standoff between the two where they're going to say, well, we're going to look to blame the Trump administration for failed policies rather than taking the blame ourselves. That's a big problem. It's not something that's going to become an issue before the midterms, but I think it's an issue that could happen after the midterms. And it all depends how long the global economy survives. And at some point it's not going to. That's an inevitability. And what's the extent of the collapse is anyone's guess. But I always said from the day Trump was elected, he knows the US economy is going to collapse. He knows the dollar's going to die. But he has to create the illusion, because if he stands up to the American people and says, well, the US economy is going to hit 2008 buffers, he's going to lose a massive amount of support and vote. He needs that vote to be able to achieve his objectives. Now, whether he can achieve his objectives is an entirely different matter, and the whole neocon influences, we're back to that point, but let's not labour that too much. Now, it neatly it seems like a bit of a sideways step, but let's go into the Khashoggi thing. I don't want to go in too much, but in a way, the US is, in this situation, is caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, my immediate question is, why is the likes of Lindsey Graham calling Mohammed bin Salman toxic? Now, why suddenly are people who for years have turned a blind eye to the internal, human rights abuses in Saudi, who've turned a blind eye to what's gone on in Yemen, have turned a blind eye to the Saudis' clear involvement in financing terrorism in the Middle East and beyond. And now suddenly it's a big problem. It was interestingly, Rand Paul said yesterday he believed that MBS is involved in the death of the journalist Khashoggi, and he's going to have to be replaced. Well, what is clear is there's definitely another coup attempt to get rid of MBS. Let's set aside whether we think MBS should be the crown prince or shouldn't. That's not really the relevant point at the moment. Thing about Khashoggi, definitely a deep state player. Turkey's involvement's interesting because it knows it's got the US and the Saudis, pardon my expression, literally by the balls, because they have. Now, Erdogan's supposed to say he's going to deliver this statement revealing the truth on the death of Khashoggi. I think there's a meeting of the ruling Justice and Development Party tomorrow. So it remains to be seen what Erdogan's saying. Now, we know that Khashoggi's been missing for, 3 weeks? We now probably have to presume he's dead. I don't think there's doubt, although I did have a suggestion that perhaps that wasn't the case, but I think that's extremely unlikely, and I think you feel that under about a 1% chance that's true. Now, of course, we know the Saudis denied his whereabouts, but now they've admitted that there was some incident which got out of hand inside the consulate. Now 18 people have been arrested, and Turkey's conducting this separate investigation into the journalist's death. Now, why is it a problem for the US? Because there's a lot of consternation now that somehow we've got to take, Saudis crossed it's the straw that broke the camel's back suddenly. So if the US acts and takes sanctions against Saudi, well, it's going to be disastrous for the US for a number of reasons. One, because Saudi will definitely ditch the petrodollar. Two, Saudi investment in the US will stop. Three, the Saudis will stop buying US arms. And all in all, it'll be an economic disaster for the US to do so, which is why even Trump goes, well, we can't really afford to do too much because in terms of the arms deal, because, financially we can't afford to do it. So then I looked around to say, okay, what else is going on? I always look to find the most innocuous responses to try and get an idea of what's really going on. Because for me, I think there was definitely a coup attempt to remove Mohammed bin Salman. Why? Because he's not Western sympathetic enough. They want someone in who's going to be more Washington and UK centric.
Like Ben Nayef.
Yes, exactly. Nayef's a great example of, who was supposed to be the crown prince. Now, what was interesting is there was a statement came out from John Sawyers, who's the former head of MI6. Now, it's alleged, he said, that all the evidence suggests that Mohammed bin Salman was behind the death of Khashoggi. And the theory that rogue elements in the Saudi military were responsible was, he said, blatant fiction. Now, the rogue elements came via Trump. Okay, it doesn't really matter, but that's... Now, he said his assessment was based on conversations with Whitehall sources and his knowledge of the Turkish intelligence services. And of course, Sawyer's claimed that the MBS would only have acted if he believed he had a license from the White House, excuse me, to behave as he wished. So he's also been quite critical of the Trump administration, effectively giving MBS carte blanche. He can do what he likes. Now, he's saying, Sawyer's, that if it's proven, and it looks likely the case, that MBS ordered the killing, it's a step too far, one that the UK, the EU, and the US are going to have to respond to. And of course, I don't entertain the idea rogue elements theory. I think essentially there's some element of truth in what Sawyers is saying in that regard. But I think the fact he's come out and made this statement is very, very telling. Also, the fact that the UK Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, said, there's going to be very, very serious consequences for US-Saudi relations if Khashoggi's murder or reports of how it happened were true. But again, they went, but we're not, steering away from ending arms sales because, Saudi's a strategic partner in the battle to constrain Iran. That's the excuse why we've got to keep arming Saudi, because there's this war against Iran. I mean, it's so tenuous, it's ridiculous. But obviously, we'll see what happens with regards to the UK's actual response. Sawyer also mentioned the fact that members of the Saudi royal family, the business community, and what he termed conservative religious clerics will take advantage of MBS's involvement to undermine him, saying there'll be this reaction in Saudi Arabia to this dreadful killing, and there will be some correction. So I think this is all very telling. The UK Trade Secretary's pulled out of this so-called Davos in the desert, which is, this financial conference, although there are some UK representatives going. We know Mnuchin's pulled out. But what does this prove? It proves what I keep saying. Everyone tries to, there's this element in the US that's trying to make out that the UK is responsible for all the ills in the US. And they're not. The US and the UK intelligence services are what I term thick as thieves. They work together. So the US deep state and the UK deep state intelligence service, I think they both want MBS out. And this is what I believe. This is only my interpretation. I think they use Khashoggi as the sacrificial lamb because, let's face it, are we supposed to believe the CIA and the MI6 wouldn't have known full well that Khashoggi was in danger going into a Saudi consulate in Istanbul? I mean, why did the guy not just go into the Saudi consulate in the US? Why did he go into Istanbul? And I think the other angle in it that Trump's been leveraged to act on this. And we know full well if Trump does, it's going to create its economic and geopolitical suicide for his administration to do so. Why? Because clearly, as soon as you implement sanctions, what's going to happen to the price of oil? Oil's going to go through the roof. You forget $100, you may see $150 a barrel. What's that going to do to the US economy? It's going to have a huge problem. If Saudi says, well, we're actually going to officially dump the petrodollar and we're going to adopt the petro yuan, we're not buying US arms anymore, the US economy would tank, and the repercussions economically would be horrendous. Geopolitically, I think it would cause the complete isolation of the US away from the Middle East. And what would that do to the Trump administration? It would be absolutely disastrous to do that. So I think Trump rightly needs to sit on the fence and be a politician for once and a diplomat and go, I'm not getting sucked into this. Mm-hmm. And what's absolutely clear is King Salman wants MBS to remain in power. I don't think there's any doubt. Whether that actually comes to pass is an entirely different matter. But what's also interesting is Erdogan's spoken with King Salman, and apparently the two have agreed to continue cooperation in the probe. What I think is absolutely clear is Turkey think they can use this for leverage, and they think that in some way they're going to come out winners out of it. That's why they're very happy to do this. They want to stick it to the Saudis. Of that, there's absolutely no doubt. But in the process, they think they could use it as further leverage with the US. And it's nice to sort of mention the Brunson thing now, because obviously we know Brunson's turned up in the US and Trump said there was no deal. Of course there's a deal. And part of the deal is the US had back off from attacking the Turkish lira. And notice how, relatively speaking, the Turkish lira has stability, in inverted commas. I don't use that in the strict sense of the word, but there's no doubt there was a deal struck. And I think also that Erdogan's trying to use this as leverage with the US. But I think there's no doubt about it. The CIA definitely would have known Khashoggi was in serious danger doing what he was doing, and they just let him do it. And I think he was. I think he's used as a pawn. And in some way, I think there's an effort to undermine Trump, and Trump needs to walk away from it and not get involved. But the problem is, it's a double-edged sword, because internally and politically, he's going to be under huge pressure from the usual suspects to be seen to act. And if he doesn't, someone's going to use it as leverage prior to the midterms. It's all just part of, again, timing is everything. The timing of this happening is no coincidence, I don't think. And because here's the point, Khashoggi's an outspoken critic of the Saudi government, but also he was very pro the so-called Arab Spring, which we know wasn't an Arab Spring. And he was seemed to be very pro aspects, which I think is highly questionable. And I do think he was a deep state asset. I don't doubt it, which is another reason why clearly he was used for me as a sacrificial lamb. And he's a pawn in a game that the deep state thought they, or the cabal, could use to leverage against Trump in the process, because ultimately, and they wanted MBS out. And I can't say with any degree of certainty if Khashoggi had any involvement in that aspect of things, but there's no doubt the byproduct of this is there's a number of people who want MBS out, and the reason they want him out is because he's not toeing the line with regards to the US. He's actively in discussions with the Russians and the Chinese about internal investment. Saudi wants to buy S-400. Saudi even wants to talks about putting a Russian military base in Saudi. So that gives you sufficient reasons why they want MBS out the way. It remains to be seen what happens, but yeah, most definitely, Nayef is an example of someone the Western cabal deep state would much rather have as the crown prince and the would-be king in Saudi because they feel he'll restore the equilibrium. MBS won't. I mean, I'm not defending MBS. I think he's made some ridiculous policy decisions internally. I think he's completely overambitious in terms of what he thinks he can do for the Saudi economy. Yes, the Saudi economy has to rotate away from oil. There's no doubt about it. But he's made some very grave errors of judgment, namely Yemen being a classic example. I mean, where's the outcry been regarding the Yemen war from any Western nation? When have they once said to Saudi Arabia, "Will you kindly cut out from bombing civilian targets in Yemen? When are you going to stop causing the famine, which is now affecting maybe up to 10 million people?" They've done nothing, but now suddenly it's a big problem. It's a big problem because people want MBS out. Because MBS, if he walks away and said tomorrow publicly, "I'm walking away from the petrodollar, I'm adopting the petro-yuan," it's game over for the dollar, it's game over for the cabal. That's the rationale for me. It boils down to that in very simple terms, why all this has come about with regards to Khashoggi anyway.
How do you think this is going to play out, especially with not only the situation in the Middle East, but I see this like why did he go into a Turkish consulate? Why? What are the angles here? And the other real thing is how this pertains to the continued severing and dismantling of not only OPEC, Paul, but the entire Middle Eastern alliance that the U.S. was pretty much the linchpin for. It's literally coming apart.
Oh yeah, it's completely falling apart. I mean, essentially, if you look at what's happened, I mean, one of the biggest mistakes, I mean, MBS did the whole Qatar blockade, and there was definitely Western backing to do this. Why? Because Qatar was actually, rotating east. It was working with the Russians, working with the Chinese, working with the Iranians. Of course, what happened? The whole blockade failed. Turkey came to the rescue of Qatar, so did the Iranians, and in fact, it just further cemented the alliance between Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and of course Qatar. That was one big, huge mistake in terms of Oman's is not really particularly interested in the West, and is far more sort of Eastern centric, for want of a better word. But nation after Iraq's another example. So gradually, the whole US control over the Middle East, and of course, the Syrian war's been an abject failure for the cabal. They failed, and it's only a matter of time before that it draws to its natural conclusion. So who's the US got left? Well, increasingly, it seems less and less Saudi. So who's its ally? Really, it's only got Israel left in the Middle East. That's it. Most of the other nations will pay tacit, sort of approval of things from the US, and then the US walks away and they do something exactly the opposite. So I think the US policy, I mean, the cabal policy was all about greater Israel and taking control of Syria and taking control of all the energy in the Middle East, and that's in tatters, and they've failed. And if people say, well, how's the cabal fail? Well, there's your example. Their policy and edict for the Middle East is over, but of course Iran is still the neocon prize asset to stay. I mean, they know they can't go to war with Iran because they'll lose. It'll be an utter humiliation for the US to attempt to do that. But they'll do everything economically to try and wreck Iran. And that's without laboring the point, is a decades-old neocon policy. Now, talking of all things neocon, this is probably likely to upset a few people. But we have to talk about Nikki Haley, and the reason we have to talk about her is
I am not going to let you talk about our future president, Paul.
well, do you know exactly? Do you know what? I made a quip on Twitter a couple of weeks ago that don't be surprised to see Nikki Haley president in the US in 2024. Well, do you know what? Many a true word said in jest, because there's been a number of developments and things that have come about. I'm not saying Haley's going to be president in 2024, but let's look at some of the background.
But that psycho doesn't mean that psycho is not going to try and run.
No, exactly. And here's the point, and this is factual. When Trump was when you've got the sort of transition phase between, the Trump coming into office in his inauguration and the end of the Obama administration, Trump actually offered Nikki Haley to be Secretary of State. I mean, she actually admitted she wasn't equipped to do the role and turned it down. So Trump came back and then offered her the role of the US ambassador to the UN. Now, that for me raises immediate alarm bells. Who was pushing Trump to get her in the administration, and why? Why do they want her in a premier position and in a top job, be it the Secretary of State or be it the US ambassador to the UN? By all accounts, it was said that she didn't really understand the machinations of the UN either, but she still took the role. Now, this looks to me like someone's trying to shoehorn her into a role to achieve a degree of prominence. Now, the question is, why has she walked away at this time? Because as things stand, she seems to have had a very successful job. Her integrity is intact. She's walked away at the right time before the risk of the proverbial hitting the fan, be it economically or geopolitically. She can go, well, I did all these great things, and I can walk away with my integrity intact. And on her CV, for want of a better word, or resume, it says US ambassador to the UN. Now, what is also interesting in her time in the UN, apparently she sought Kissinger out, of all people, as a mentor, and met him periodically, every few months, couple of months, whatever it was. That's a bit of a worry. And what did she do as well that was pretty obvious? She was really, her record on Israel is pretty clear. She went into great efforts to blockade the investigation in Palestinian deaths in Gaza. Also, what's quite telling is who's backed her already financially. Sheldon Adelson, the same person who's financially backed Trump in 2016, and also Adelson's actually financially backed the midterms by, I don't know, not as much as the presidential election, but still a substantial amount, over $10 million. She also got the US to withdraw from the Human Rights Council in respect of Israel, and also cutting all US funds to the UN Workers Fund that is designed to keep essentially Palestinians alive. She was also instrumental in part for the US Embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and to get the US to move away from a two-state solution. So I think that pretty much shows her leanings with regards to Israel and Palestine. So the question is, she announces her retirement. All the media's full of praise for her. I mean, and interesting, she came out with a statement a day or two ago contradicting Trump, where Trump said that, the Democrats are evil, and she's gone, oh no, the Democrats are not evil. Why did she say that? What exactly is a position? And for me, I think she's been primed to make a move for the presidential race in 2024. This may sound ridiculous, it may never happen, but here's the point we've always said. The neocons can, as long as Trump's not doing anything disruptive, they'll just leave him be. He's actually put a lot of neocons in his cabinet or in his government, but they know that Trump's a transient president. At the most, he's got 6 years left. And I rightly asked the question of someone, would it even be beyond the bounds of possibility that Trump will be kind of advised to retire in 2020 and stands away and lets Nikki Haley stand for the presidency. I wouldn't even rule that out. That is why I'm deeply concerned by the neocon influence that is inside the Trump administration. This is not a reflection of Trump. Trump's not a neocon. Trump's not cabal, but he could be very easily be manipulated. And I certainly think Haley's a shoe-in for either, particularly for the 2024, but maybe even the 2020. The 2020 may be a bridge too far, and that's really speculation on my behalf, and it's probably less than likely to happen. But she left the UN role as ambassador because she knows what's coming. She knows the geopolitical shitstorm that's going to develop. She knows the economic shitstorm, and she can walk away knowing full well what's coming and then come back and go, well, I did a great job as a UN ambassador. Whether she did or she didn't doesn't matter, because everyone will remember, oh, she did this great job. She walked away with her head held high. But she's, for me, is an extremely dangerous person to have as a potential US presidential candidate. I mean, we think that, I jokingly made the point before we came on air. Can you imagine if you had a presidential runoff between Clinton and Haley? And I'm not suggesting that's ever going to happen. But I think it's a toss-up between who would you least like to have in, and I certainly wouldn't want Clinton in, but equally I wouldn't want Haley as president. But I think there's elements that want to see that happen. Now, I'm not saying they're going to succeed, and a lot can happen between 2020 and 2024, for example. But again, there's too much neocon influence inside the Trump administration, and when Trump eventually ceased to be president, if he wins a landslide in the midterms, which he should do, if he wins the 2020 presidentials and he stays on till 2024, what happens after 2024? Trump's no longer president. And the cabal types, they don't think in terms of weeks and months. They think in terms of years. And if they have to tread water for a number of years to get someone in position they want, who's going to be completely amenable to them, they'll wait. And that's the thing. The US has a myriad of problems to sort out, and it doesn't have a lot of time to sort it out in relative terms. This is why, come back to the point, post the midterms in a matter of weeks, Trump is going to have to start to make some big strides forward. You're going to have to start to see all the things we anticipate happening. And I don't anticipate mass arrests as people think. I think you will see some prominent people, but I hope we see prominent people on all sides of the political divide. But there's no doubt a lot of people will be having plea deals because they're far better having a plea deal and actually being able to attack the cabal further up the food chain because of what the knowledge they possess. So I think a lot of that will go on. I don't think it will happen the way people expect it to. Yeah. But put it this way, if we get to early 2019 and we get into the first few months and there's nothing happening, I'm not saying that's going to be the case, by the way, then we need to start being seriously concerned. And also, if we see the Democrats being put on the chopping block and we don't see any heads rolling from the Republican side of the equation, then we should equally be worried as well. And that, this Haley development, I think, is something we need to pay attention to. But she didn't back out at this time just as a coincidence. There was a measured reason for doing this, and I don't doubt she was advised to do so by whoever she was advised to do so. But rather like I think Pence was put in, that if Trump didn't play ball and they'd end up trying to impeach Trump, then Pence was an ideal shoe-in to keep the ball rolling from the neocon perspective. I don't think it was. That's exactly why he was selected as vice president. Mm-hmm. And his comments regarding China proves which side of the political fence he sits on in reality. I mean, the guy's hardly said anything, and now suddenly he's becoming very vocal.
Right. Paul, we're at the end of the show. Once again, folks, the website is thesiriusreport.com, thesiriusreport.com. For less than the price of a coffee at Starbucks, get yourself the day-to-day daily dose of Paul rather than your daily dose of Joe in the morning. And with that being said, again, folks, subscribe, like, comment, and share. And we are over and out. Take it away, CJ.